Hello, everybody. Good day. My name is Phillida Travis, and I am the moderator of this session. Welcome to the second day of the 11th AAAH plenary sessions with its incredibly topical theme, addressing healthcare workers' challenges in response to COVID-19. This is the second of 3 webinars. Yesterday, we discussed country experience and lessons in mobilizing surge capacity of health workers. And tomorrow, the theme will be about health workforce education and training in the context of COVID. Today, however, we focus on the important question of occupational risk protection of health workers. This came up yesterday as an essential part of effectively mobilizing surge capacity, but we're going to explore this in more depth today. The point of this, the objective of this, is so that we can do better, both now and also next time. We have 90 minutes and we have a really great selection of speakers today, so I'm not going to talk further. There will be a chance for Q&A later in the session, and all slides from all of the sessions are going to be available in the next 1 to 2 weeks. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in our first speaker, who is Gülin Gedik. Dr. Gülin is Coordinator Health Workforce, the Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office of WHO. She's going to present a summary of issues raised in 2 earlier webinars on this objective, occupational risk protection of health workers. Over to you, Gülin.
Thank you very much, Phillida. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Dear colleagues, friends, it is great pleasure and honor for me to be here together at the 11th AAAH conference, and also in the past in many of them. So I'll try to provide the summary of the second group of webinars, which is about focusing on the occupational health and safety of health workers. And these webinars, the first one focused on the health workers against occupational safety of healthcare workers against infection, COVID-19 infection and mortality. And the second one focused on psychosocial and mental health impact of COVID-19 on healthcare workers. Both webinars witnessed very rich information and insightful discussions, and they were attended by very esteemed presenters, commentaries, and participants. So, first of all, I would like to acknowledge all the contributions to these webinars, because I'm going to try to make a justice to these rich discussions, and I'll use some of the slides to reflect better from those webinars. So, health workers have been at the forefront of the response to COVID-19, both as service providers and also as high-risk groups for contracting the disease. The rapidly increasing workload has resulted in shortages in health workforce, and thus to the increased workload and highly stressful working environment that have led to long working hours, psychological distress, fatigue, occupational burnout, and sometimes even physical and psychological violence. Health workers are also at the risk of becoming infected or even losing their lives, or may fear transmitting the infection to their family and beloved ones. So, and also this resulted with disruption in health professional education, which will be the topic of tomorrow. So we will focus on the safety and health and safety of health workers. So the risk of having COVID-19 is generally considered higher in healthcare workers than the rest of the population, as they are more exposed to the disease. However, there is no standardized, accurate, or reliable data on the magnitude of the healthcare worker infection as well as their mental health, psychosocial impacts. Eventually, some studies are coming up with different figures. During our webinars, it was presented as 3.1% of all cases in Philippines, 3.4% of all cases in Thailand. Yesterday, you have heard from Howard that a range between 2 to 30% varying from country to country, with an average of 10%. And I think this figure is in line with figures from some countries and emerging studies. Majority of cases are seen among the nurses, as we see in Thailand, which was 42% of the cases were among the nurses, and 59% in Egypt. And also these countries indicated higher infection among female health workers. So it is also assumed that healthcare workers are at higher risk of getting COVID disease because of the nature of their work. However, caution must be observed in this assumption, as it may neglect other possible causes of the infection. For example, a study in Thailand showed 54% of COVID-19 infection in health workers was due to the nature of their work, while this figure was much less in Egypt, 27%. And in Egypt, significant percent of the health workers were infected from their colleagues, more related to social interactions, like in the cafeteria, in the rest areas, etc. And another significant result for exposure is community exposure of health workers, which is attributed 14% of the infection in Egypt and 19% in Thailand. During the first few months of the pandemic, higher healthcare infections were attributed to the lack of available personal protective equipment and lack of training. But also, some health workers reported that part of this was also due to their increased access compared to the rest of the population to the testing. So that also resulted higher results. And also when we look at the place of work, of course, we can see higher, in Thailand, it shows 1/4 of the cases were mainly among the health workers working in ICUs, very close to the patient. Also, health workers faces a number of stressors which affect their mental and health and psychosocial health. With this sudden increase in the number of patients, which overwhelmed the hospitals, along with isolation and quarantine of other health staff who get infected or had contact with known cases, the workload of the remaining health workers increased significantly, with very difficult working conditions, such as long working hours, fatigue, wearing uncomfortable PPEs, etc. And fear of infection uncertainties also affected their stress level. They also had to endure stigma from their communities and societies, being suspected of potentially spreading cases outside the hospitals. So as a result of that, countries all reported some increasing stress among the healthcare workers. For example, in Qatar, around 30% of approximately 5,000 healthcare staff working on COVID-19 reported moderate to severe form of mental health distress in the form of anxiety, depression, stress, and insomnia. In Thailand, higher proportion of health workers reported depression, stress, burnout compared to the overall population. A number of different studies also indicate between 30 to 50% of health workers reported different levels of psychosocial distress. The countries have addressed these challenges in different ways. This slide from Philippines is a good way of addressing the healthcare worker infections. I think it really highlights the need for prevention, prevent, detect, isolate, treat, and recovery. And there are some interventions and actions to be taken at every stage of this continuum. And also, I'd like to share this slide from Qatar in addressing the psychosocial and mental health of health workers, in improving and maintaining their well-being. I think the number of activities here are already representing the common activities which have been undertaken by all countries who presented and who joined the webinars. If I try to give a summary of these common actions, communication is really key in is really key in addressing
อันแรกๆเขาจะให้เราทำให้
Please mute, colleagues. Please mute.
Communication and constant updating of health workforce was one of the ways the countries implemented to address the anxiety of health workers towards the pandemic. In Qatar, while daily information about pandemic seemed to be very much appreciated, using SMS was promoted to facilitate communication between healthcare workers in Japan. The relevant measures are also disseminated to healthcare workers on a regular basis, reflecting the new updates and understanding about the disease, such as instructional videos. Generally, all countries implemented infection control measures in the health facilities that aimed at reducing the risk of infection of healthcare workers. This includes putting in place surveillance monitoring mechanisms for infection among health workers, as well as the safety nets and available safety nets to ensure treatment and recovery in case of infection and illness. Infection and prevention and control policies and measures are quickly implemented also in healthcare settings. In Thailand and Pakistan, we have heard examples of audits at the hospitals. These audits check the incident action plan, policies, the committees in charge of infection control, as well as screening and surveillance measures. This was also accompanied by environmental and managerial components of infection prevention and control, which are emphasized, such as emphasize the ventilation, patient flow, and similar measures. In many countries, some flexibilities introduced into work arrangements. Initially, it was more of the logistics that determined policies and measures to be implemented. For example, due to lack of PPEs, longer working hours were implemented in some countries to maximize the use of PPEs, while it is being compensated with some additional free time. In Qatar, flexible work arrangements were implemented to balance and adapt to the need of minimizing the contact and the need to ensure well-being of the healthcare staff. So, or availing additional leave credits, allowing healthcare workers to return to work as normally as possible after quarantine or recovery, were also facilitated in some of the countries. Psychosocial and mental health support has been also critical in many countries, different ways. This was provided in different ways. Telephone hotlines, helplines have been one of the common ones introduced in many of the countries, Qatar and Pakistan and so on. Training has been critical. Online training of the staff in the facilities was implemented on various areas, infection control and measures, new guidelines and facility guidelines and manuals, also as well as updates on the COVID-19 situation in the countries. So in the Philippines, the decline of infection among healthcare workers was observed when the training programs on infection control and prevention for health workers were rolled out. So training of health workers on mental health was also emphasized and implemented in many countries to address the increasing burden of mental health among health workers. The limited physical interaction imposed everywhere as a social distancing measure resulted improved use of digital technologies through online platforms for reducing the mental health stress and stress of health workers. Also in terms of telemedicine and other methodologies.
Can I nudge you, Gulin?
I'm finishing. It has been also critical to support health workers with some incentives and compensation, and these were introduced in different formats, including special access to testing, supporting measures during isolation or quarantine, free treatment coverage, compensation in case of severe illness of that, or in some incentives to motivate them and to keep them in the service. So in addition to that, it was very important to recognize health workers, not just recognition and appreciation in many, as it happened in many countries, just applauding, but real recognition, real support and compensation has been critical. So I would like to emphasize, we are really challenged with this pandemic to create a resilient health workforce and to demonstrate our solidarity in taking forward all these learnings. I would like to conclude my presentation with the motto of the World Patient Safety Day this year. Keep health workers safe, keep patients safe. I think this is very, very critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gulin. That was a really excellent summary. And I particularly like the last point, keeping health workers safe means you keep patients safe as well. We're going to now begin with our panel of 3 experts to reflect on these issues that Gulin has just summarized. But before that, I want to alert people to the Q&A, the question and answer button, which is at the bottom of everybody's screen. This allows you to write questions that you would like the panelists to answer, and we will screen them. And depending on the time we've got available after the 3 speakers, the 3 panelists, we will get them to comment on some of those questions. So please start thinking now about issues you think are really important to bring up. So without further ado, yet again, I'm going to go to our first panelist, which is Professor Jim Buchan, who's based at the WHO Collaborating Centre, University of Technology in Sydney, but seems to be everywhere else in all 3 regions as well, and who is a long-time ally of AAAH. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Philida. I'm actually speaking to you from my home country of Scotland. So it's almost coming up to midday here, and I appreciate that some of my friends and colleagues in the Western Pacific region, it's so late, it's almost early. I'm going to speak hopefully for less than 10 minutes, reflecting on some of the key messages that I've picked up I have had the benefit of being able to listen in to all the webinars arranged by AAAH across the period since August. And I think what has been achieved is quite remarkable in terms of the depth of detail and the ability to share knowledge across borders and understand both the commonalities of the challenges, but also some of the differences that are clear country by country. I have a very short PowerPoint presentation. It's only going to be 3 or 4 slides. And what I intend doing is using that to just reflect partly on what I've heard from Gulen, but also give some of my own thoughts, both on what I've heard today, but also what I've picked up across the period since the beginning of the seminar series back in August. The first thing I'm going to do is just the first slide I'm using is to locate the issues that we are discussing about health workforce and the broader issues of health systems and how health systems are having to respond to the challenges of COVID. I'm just using a slide here which was developed by WHO European Office. But I think it's helpful in focusing us on both where we are looking in detail in the workforce, which is the slides there picked up in red, but also recognizing that that's only part of the broader picture. And whilst we are looking at the workforce, we need to look beyond the workforce and some of the issues that are clearly coming through. And I think one of the key challenges and questions I have for the participants and beyond is, to what extent do the workforce responses that we're seeing in relation to COVID really reflect necessary responses that should have been happening anyway? Or are we accelerating responses that should be in place? Or are there really new innovations in terms of what we're having to do to ensure that the workforce is protected, is motivated, is incentivized, understand what's going on? And it's partly rhetorical. I think that a lot of what we're talking about was happening in the best practice areas anyway. Perhaps it's having to be accelerated, but overall, there's perhaps less new than we think there is in terms of what's happening. Just picking up on one of the issues that Gulen had mentioned in terms of data and looking at impact on the workforce. I happen to be, as I said, in Scotland, and this is very new data that has been published a couple of weeks ago in the British Medical Journal. Very, very large data set of 150,000 plus staff working in the National Health Service. And the researchers have been able to link the workforce data sets with data sets related to hospital attendance. And it essentially tells us what we probably knew anyway, but it begins to put some calibration and metrics on that. The findings were that healthcare workers and their households contributed about 1/6 of the cases that were admitted to hospital, but the risks of admission, whilst low overall, were about 3-fold for what they call patient-facing healthcare workers and about twice for those household members of workers. So there is a clear message there that patient-facing healthcare workers particularly are vulnerable to infection, and the people they live with are also vulnerable to infection. Deeper analysis highlighted that what the researchers called front door specialties within the healthcare workforce were at the highest risk of admission with COVID-19. Those tend to be ones that are working in emergency rooms, accident emergency outpatients, who are first point of contact and may not necessarily have full PPE. And finally, there was the ability to look at different occupations within the healthcare workforce, and nursing was most prominent in terms of the level of risk. what does this tell us? Well, we need to get into this level of data to understand how the health workforce is being impacted, both in terms of immediate management responses about how to manage high differential levels of absence between different groups within the workforce. Secondly, to identify early where there is greatest risk of longer term absence, which might be related to psychosocial challenges. And also to begin to use that data to model and look at scenarios as we move into next year. Some countries are going to have to continue to deal with a relatively high incidence of COVID and will be relying on rolling out as quickly as they can vaccines when they become available. And that will be a different but very challenging health workforce issue for countries that need to rely on vaccines. And beyond that also, we have the challenges that we're just beginning to understand in terms of what is being called long COVID, which are the longer term NCD issues related to some patients who have contracted it and will have chronic conditions. Essentially, what I've done here is try to capture on one slide some of the key points that I've picked up from the previous webinars and what I've learned already in terms of reading about what we're going to discuss today. And several issues that have come through to me, as I said earlier, I think they are or should be there anyway in an organization that's effective. But preparedness, readiness is one thing, being ready to act. The other is understanding that you may have been preparing for the last pandemic rather than the one that you're dealing with. So the ability to be flexible in terms of responsiveness at organization level, I think, is critical. And that demands a lot of policymakers and managers, as well as those in the front line. The second point is using data to inform action. And we're not yet in most countries at a situation where we can evaluate what's happening, but we can certainly help understand what the priorities should be and where the focuses of intervention should be. And one of the critical areas there clearly, as I've mentioned, is the absence rates in different parts of the health workforce, developing a better understanding of how these vary and in order to identify where we need to focus our attention. Third point, Gulen emphasized it, and it's come through very strongly, and that's the need for rapid and accurate communications. That's to and within the workforce, that's via the media, and that's directly to the population in order that people can understand what's going on and their needs. The use of technology in terms of enabling workers to be more efficient, enable workers to be where they aren't, but still contribute. In terms of use of technology for improved communications, I think this is going to be a very rich area for evaluation over the next 2 or 3 years. And what we've seen is an accelerated use of technology in many health systems, which before the impact of pandemic, were moving much more slowly. Flexible hours for workers. I think we also need to be looking at the need for respite time away from front-end and challenging working environments, and looking at how we can rotate flexibly workers through so that they do not become burned out. And a final point really there is that we're talking today about incentives, and I think that in some cases these incentives are more about compensation rather than incentivizing changes in behavior or types of behavior. And I think we need to be clear about what particularly financial remuneration is about. Is it to secure changed behavior, to work in a different area, to work differently? Or is it rightly recognizing the huge workload challenges that many individual workers are having to face? Essentially, I'm going to draw an end to my contribution there. I think it's much more important that we have a dialogue. But I would like to finish and reinforce what has already been said, that we're not going to achieve long-term secure population health and patient safety without workforce safety. And therefore, we need to be looking across that continuum. Thanks very much for your attention. I've left the references there and people can pick up on those later on if they're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think that was very succinct, and I won't re-summarize your summary. We'll come back to some of the issues later. I think within the interests of time, I'd like to move on to Miss Ellen Koo, the President of the College of Nursing in Hong Kong and representative of the ICN. Ellen, are you ready? Over to you.
Okay. Good evening from Hong Kong, and ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. My name is Ellen from College of Nursing Hong Kong and a member association of ICN. I'm very pleased and honored to be here to share some of the key issues from ICN. I think during the pandemic, ICN has shared with the member associations a lot of the update information at the beginning as we were lack of informations. And ICN has worked closely with WHO and provide advices for some of their resources. And also they work closely with different national nursing associations and partners and have a strong link and collaborate to diffuse the resources worldwide. They have lots of resources like nursing practice and related to COVID-19, and they work with the World Continuing Education Alliances to provide some of the free courses to help the frontline health workers and the nurses to update, to prepare with the update informations. And later on, they have a survey on protecting nurses to get information from the NNAs. So there are some responses, although some of the informations might not be very comprehensive, but a few countries, 30-something countries will respond to the questionnaires, and we definitely see that 10% of the health workers has been infected during the pandemic, and also there are some nurses died from the pandemic. So and also only 48% of the countries in response do recognize COVID-19 as an occupational disease for the frontline health workers. And also half of the NNAs report that the compensation is available from the government for the healthcare workers infected with COVID-19 when they expose the disease in the workplaces. And also 70% of the respondents received reports of incidents of violence or discriminations against the frontline health workers due to COVID-19. So we are facing a lot of violence and discriminations. And there are regular reports about mental health distress from nurses in the COVID-19 responses. And also 70% of the NNAs reported psychological support for nurses is available in their countries. And also some NNAs indicated there are moderate to severe shortage of personal protective equipment in the long-term care facilities in their country. And actually in some countries, there are not enough PPEs in the acute settings. And also 80% of the NNA state that guidelines and recommendations for the healthcare workers testing for COVID-19 are available in their countries. And there are only 56% of the countries' response state that there are formal infection preventive controls training or refresher courses on the use of PPE in the last 6 months at the time the questionnaire is launched. And from the Hong Kong's perspective, we would like to send a gratitude to ICN, which they have in connection with nurses globally during the pandemic, especially at the very beginning. And I think ICN has provided a platform for the frontline workers when we are facing an unknown attack at the very beginning. So the peer support is important. And also, we also look into some key issues at the moment, and there is some mental health issues. The pandemic is increasing the demand for mental health services like bereavement, isolation, loss of income, and fear for triggering mental health conditions. Many people may be facing increasing level of substance abuses, insomnia, anxiety, etc. And we look into this, and then there is a survey from WHO and showing that 93% of the country reported disruption or halting of the critical mental health services at this point of time when the mental health services is at risk. 80% have provided no additional fundings during the pandemic at the time of rising demand for help. Only 50% of the country have identified mental health services as part of their pandemic plans. ICN in response have updated the mental health position statement, recognizes the additional burden of COVID-19 has placed on people's mental health, and urge governments to put mental health at the center of the pandemic recovery plans, highlights the mental health effects of the pandemic on the mental health of nurses. And the other concerns and hot topics, like there is a need for a pay rise for nurses, and also the priorities for nurses to have vaccination once when it is available. Investment in sustaining healthy, safe, and decent working conditions for all health workers, enabling all countries and regions of the world to achieve universal health coverage through people. The key words here I would like to highlight is sustaining. Maintaining the good working condition cannot be an ad hoc issue or cannot be a fragmented issue. It has to be sustaining and ensure that all frontline workers were in a good conditions. Being a health worker and a key member in the healthcare team, we are the front door keepers. Human serves human. Governments needs to look into the investment for supporting these healthcare workers, especially those working frontline. The key investment areas are education and training, as lots of information has been shared about, and recognizes this COVID-19 as an occupational disease. Make sure the frontline workers are well protected, like personal protective equipment, decent working environment, vaccination, zero tolerance to violence or discriminations, mental health support. And the workers has to be paid appropriately. And then all members should be, the voices should be heard, especially nurses. We occupy a large number of workers among the frontline workers. Therefore, key members should be involved in the allocation of resources, strategic planning, and management of the working condition, etc. So, so that when the investment for the health workers is ensured, then we can ensure the services to be provided and ensure the safety of the service users. So this year is the International Year of Nurses and Midwives. Nurses and midwives plays a vital role in providing healthcare services, plus with other healthcare members. And multidisciplinary approach is very important. So we are also always say that we are shortage of manpowers, but we also need to retain the manpowers in the workforce. Therefore, ICN call to actions, and we urgently we have to urgently prioritize the readily access to sufficient quantity of high quality appropriate PPEs for nurses and other frontline health workers, ensuring all nurses have appropriate evidence-based infections prevention and control training and the guidelines and trainings, and protect the health and well-being of nurses and health workers who are going to provide services. Rapidly implement scale-up comprehensive surveillance system to track the investigate healthcare workers' infections, because we haven't have a very clear numbers of workers being infected. Ensure the financial protection and compensation for nurses and health workers, and also safe and effective deployment of nursing staffs and health workers to areas of high demand and high complexity as needed. Encourage and develop and support new model of care and innovations. Demonstrate public support and recognize the value of nurses to the society. Also capitalize on nursing leadership. Development and implement a comprehensive and coordinate COVID-19 public health strategies. And we all learn from the COVID-19 pandemics and to be prepared for the future. So we call to action, human serves human, and we hope that we can work together and to ensure the health services will be provided with quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ellen.
Yeah, thank
that
you.
was really, really excellent. You gave a real feel for the problem facing health workers, which is something that's different from our sort of normal working. The real risk of, in some cases, violence and discrimination because of the stigma attached to an untreatable disease, at least at the start, and the fear that that engenders for the health workers and their families. You also, both you and Jim, I think, were really usefully set the whole question of risk protection for health workers in the broader context of the health system. And this leads you on to thinking not just what do we do now in the heat of the pandemic, but what must we be doing longer term to sustain good work, a well-performing workforce in a crisis? What do we need to do to working conditions? What do we need to do to numbers of health workers? And lastly, both you and Jim also touched, I think, on something very important, which is it's not only about hospital health workers, it's also about health workers in the community putting themselves at risk. And quite often in the debates to now, we've had more attention on hospital workers who are most definitely at risk, but we haven't perhaps had as much attention on the risks that primary care workers are putting themselves under, and they are a key part of the response. So just a few reflections before we move on to our third panelist, who is Dr. Tuan, Deputy Director of Health Policy and Strategy Institute in Vietnam. And he has no slides, and he's going to talk very much about the experience of Vietnam. Over to you, Tuan.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, the Children's organizer, for creating the opportunity for me to join this plenary session. So, ladies and gentlemen, for this topic, I would like to have some reflection on 2 points. The first point is I would like to have some discussion about the work-related impact of the COVID-19. According to the synthesis, summary synthesis, because in the synthesis, we mentioned about the physical stress, social stigma, and mental stress. But might have some discussion that from Vietnam experience, we consider one more point that I don't know we could put in the mental stress or the physical stress, but it's related to the I can call that like the professional, like the stress, because this is a very new disease and impact a lot of the not only the health sector but also the other sector, the social as well as the new, because they are the new this is new disease. So not all the doctor, all the health workers, they know about the clearly about the clinical and how to deal with that. So in Vietnam, doctor and the nurse in hospital, especially in the local hospital, they worry about the cases, the clinical. They not sure that they can treat and can follow up that patient. That's why they have worry about that. So I think that's one of the threat from the professional thing. So I would like to have some comment. So we can consider and maybe put in somewhere the separate or put in the maintenance threat. One of the reasons they have the maintenance threat. So that is the my consider. So for the intervention, so I will talk later from for the next point. The second point that for the intervention, I very highly appreciate for the all presentation from the webinar to highlight a lot of the intervention from different countries. So I think that it's very useful for not for other countries but also for Vietnam. But from my point of view, I see that most of the intervention more consider about the role of the health sector. I didn't see clearly about the role of the other sector and also from the government, because the pandemic, it's the effect not only the health sector but every area of the country, like the economic, the tourist, and the normal life of the people. So that is we should think maybe have some more to point out some more intervention or some role of the other sector to contribute to how to solve that the threat of the health worker, to reduce the effect of the COVID to the health worker. For example, in Vietnam, we according to the presentation, I just see about the changing environment to in the working place. But in Vietnam, we have one more intervention that we change the working place. Not only working place, we change the environment for the health worker. That means that we can move the health worker. They work in the COVID place outside hospital to the other place, the quarantine place. But they feel to make them feel that they feel at home. They have some relax. They have the time to recover their energy as well as for the mental health. In Vietnam, is the second wave of the COVID in Da Nang. It's more severe than the first wave. We already have intervention that to send the other team from other province to come to support the Da Nang, and the people, the health worker in the hospital in Da Nang, they can have the rotation, the team rotation between hospital, and they working for 8 hours, and then they can go out hospital by the special vehicle to come to the quarantine place. That is a hotel, 5-star, 3-star hotel. It's a very good condition, and they can stay there and have a good food, and they have the time to sleep, and they feel that at home. So that is one of the like the changing environment for the health worker to reduce the stress of the health worker. So it's one of the practical intervention that Vietnam have applied in the second wave of the COVID in Vietnam. And the other thing for related to the intervention to solve problem of the professional clinical stress of the people, of the health worker, especially for the doctor at the province, even for the district hospital, that we create not only provide the clinical guideline, but we quickly apply the telemedicine to and create some like the agenda for consultation, remote consultation from expert from Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, and Central Hospital to the local hospital. anytime if they need. So that the pupil, the doctor as the local, they more confident to work with the patient, and they can confident, and they not worry about their capacity. So this is one of the intervention that we already conduct in Vietnam, so that the thing. And the other intervention that we should consider, but that is the role of the other sector, for because the doctor and health worker, they have stress not only by the work, the COVID working, they worry about the family. So because they are quarantined, so they worry about the family. So, for example, for the bring the children to the school or the other thing at the home. So in Vietnam, we have some like the social work to support their family at home, so that they feel very confident that someone to help their family at home. That they reduce their stress. When they work in the hospital. That is some of the intervention that in Vietnam we have done in the two wave of the COVID in Vietnam. From this one, I have some comment that in order to conduct that intervention, the health sector should have some preparation. The first, we have to prepare the mobile team, not only from the COVID place, but also from other province not have the COVID, to make sure that when we can have the trained team to motivate to come to the COVID place to support them and to support them. The second thing, that we create the network of the expert over the country, especially the expert from the central hospital. They can support the local anytime. That the second thing. The third thing, that we also have to like the supporting team, not only in the clinical but also for the preventive. That team can come and work at the other province to support the local people for the preventive activity. For example, for the isolating, for the quarantine, and as a quarantine place. The third thing that I would like to mention, that the role of the local, the government, and the other sector, that they have a commitment and they should prepare for that. For example, in Vietnam, for the hotel, normally when the team come from other province to come to Da Nang, and the Da Nang local committee and the people at the committee, they prepare the hotel and also the food and everything to support to receive the team from other province or the center to come. And the second thing, that we also have the community. They can provide the food for the doctor who work in the COVID place, that they feel in order to help the doctor feel that they still have the food as their family. So they feel very relaxed. So this is one of the third thing. And finally, I would like to have some idea that to reduce the impact of the COVID on the human resource when they work with the COVID-19, to reduce the physical stress, mental stress. So we should think about the changing environment, and also for to have them feel like the at home. Yeah, that is some my comment. So I would like to provide some information that up to now in Vietnam we have only 1,300 cases among, but we have only 35 health worker suffer from COVID. That is very successful. Only 0.3% is the infection people is the health worker. That is one of the our success. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Tuan. That was a really interesting set of observations that I think complements really well what other speakers have already said. Let me just highlight 3 that particularly struck me. You brought out repeatedly the important role of other sectors, which we hadn't focused on that much before. And I think you gave some really practical examples. For example, the hotel industry having to be engaged because in Vietnam you've been using hotels to provide safe places for health workers to stay in quarantine when they're outside the hospital. You talked about the role of local government. You talked about the role of social workers in supporting families of health workers. And you talked within the health sector, I think you brought out strongly a point already raised about the importance of teams working across levels, for example, networks of experts, central experts supporting local hospitals. So a whole wealth of things to add into our rich mix of discussion. So what I'm going to do now is to pick up on some of the questions that have been coming in thick and fast and pass them on to our panelists. The first one that came in that I think it would be nice to hear a little more about, because I know people are interested in it, is about measures to maintain the income of health workers. It was compensation. All our speakers touched on it, but I wondered if they'd like to add any particular points with examples. Who should I look for first? Gulin, do you want to have a go at that first?
Thank you, Philida. I think this is an important question, and different types of incentives and compensations have been discussed in the webinar. And I think there were different examples. This issue of losing the income during the COVID infection has not been raised too much. It hasn't come up, but I think there was an emphasis from Philippines reiterating when they introduced any incentives, compensations, they covered both public and private sector. I think the loss is more concerned in the private sector. So there were some examples like that. And I would be interested in hearing about other countries which has faced this problem, loss of income, which we haven't seen much, which has not raised in the discussions in the webinar much. But maybe other panelists can have different views on that.
Thank you. I think it also relates to protecting income when they are sick. And some compensation there. But Jim, would you like to comment on this at all?
Yeah, I think it's a question from Andre. Hello, Andre, all's well in Indonesia. The question is really important, and I'm aware that in countries that I have knowledge of, that segments of the workforce have been provided with income support or income protection when they've been infected and in hospital, whereas other segments haven't. It might be because they're in the private sector and they're not covered, or it might be that they are self-employed or agency workers and not covered, or it might be a difference between formal healthcare sector and voluntary workers or frontline volunteers. And the risk there, I think, is if there is not good coverage across the system in total, that you're creating weak points. As Andre has said, if you are an individual and you do not have income protection, you're going to probably try and carry on working, which is not good for you or for the population at large. So there needs to be, as much as possible, a comprehensive approach to this to ensure that the whole workforce, in its broadest sense, is covered. Otherwise, wherever there are weak points, the pandemic will enter and create more problems for the system.
Thanks, Jim. I mean, to me, it relates also a little bit to what we should be thinking of in terms of anticipating needs versus reacting during the pandemic. And what I've been struck by is how a lot of the compensation mechanisms have been developed on the hoof during the pandemic, and the questions whether we can sustain those arrangements for any future pandemics, which will surely occur. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on this? If not, we have many questions. I'm just looking at you on the screen.
I would like to answer the question for Panarus, the question number 2, for the remote role of the remote professional assistant to assist the health worker in the local with pandemic. As I mentioned during my previous speech, so in Vietnam we apply this one, and every time from beginning of the COVID in the first round, first episode, we already create the teleconference to create the tele remote consultation, which gather the expert from the different central hospital to support support the hospital in the south and the middle who receive the treatment with the COVID patient, especially in the ICU. So they can give the recommendation, they give the resistance, and also have comment on the medicine as well as for the ECMO, for example, for ECMO. They can follow up the patient, so they can give the decision very early. That's why the rate of the death in Vietnam is very, you don't have the death in the first round. But the second round, because of the most of the people who are in the ICU and renal dialysis, so that's why more death. But with the remote professional assistant, we can kill a lot of the people. So let's see. I confirm that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Tuan. Dr. Ms. Ellen or Jim or Gulin, would you like to say anything from your experience about this remote technical support, which is something that's come up with all our attention to digital technology? Jim, let me point at you first.
Thanks, Philida. I touched on this earlier, but I think one of the long-term changes that COVID has forced on us is a more rapid acceleration in the use and adoption of various technologies. And in terms of various types of remote care or remote consultation, that's one of the areas where I think things have moved very rapidly. And one of the questions that I have, so I'm answering the question with a question, in a sense, is that how much of this is going to be sustained and embedded and rolled out in health systems, or how much do, in some systems, we see a rollback on this if it's felt to be, for example, cutting across the autonomy of individual professionals, or perhaps undermining their ability to earn more money if there's a fee-for-service based system. So I think there is appetite and a recognition that we have seen rapid progress generally in the right direction with technology, but we will need to be very cautious about ensuring that there is not a rollback on the use of this where it's been effective. And the question secondary there is, how do you measure, assess effectiveness? And that's something that I think across all the policy responses to COVID, we're not yet in a position of being able to do that, because the reaction, the responses has had to be very quick. And we are not necessarily always well informed about policy impact yet.
Thanks, Jim. It's a good reminder that actually we're still quite in the early days with this disease. I mean, it only appeared in January. And we sometimes forget that with the avalanche of data that has been generated, we're not really yet in a position to evaluate. I think the prospects are probably good for evaluation. There's a real interest in trying to learn, but I think both you and Tuan have put your finger on the really big question, which is after everything has calmed down, how do we sustain what we have learned this time round? We've had many, many pandemics before, maybe not recently had something quite as global as this, but we have a very good track record, all of us in all our countries, of sort of the elastic band is usually, the pressure is to go back to old practices. So what will stick? Can I ask other panelists, have they got any thoughts on what might be the most likely good innovations that will stick without too much effort, either because they don't challenge interest groups like Jim hinted at, or because they aren't that expensive once they've been set up? Ms. Ellen, have you got any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I think in Hong Kong is a small city, so we might not have the issue like remote area, things like in Vietnam. But during the COVID-19, we have a lot of nursing home in Hong Kong, and then we close all these nursing home. Even the relatives or the families cannot go in to visit them. Actually, they are in isolation. And I think at this point of time, some technology helps the connection with the families, like they implement some communication tools and things like that. We need time for education for the elderly, for the general public, on how to use technology to help to bridge them, to bridge the gap when they cannot visit. And some of the services, the clinic services or the usual practice were stopped. And then we do have some services try to use innovative technology to help, but it is not generally implemented at the moment. Yeah, I think it is at the beginning, but I think with the COVID-19, it speed up the development here, and lots of innovative technology people try to help with health services. This is a good integration to begin with. And I think this will go on even after the COVID-19 is a starting point at this point of time for us. Yeah,
right. Dr. Tuan, do you think it will continue after some of these increased use of technologies for either support or training or consultations, patient consultations, all of which are part of reducing occupational risk? What are the chances in Vietnam of that continuing?
Yeah, yes, of course. In Vietnam, I think that the last in Vietnam we very highly appreciate the success of the applied technology for the COVID, because in the technology not only for the technical support for in terms of the clinical and also the professional team, but also for the ICEC. The IC here is not only for the pupil, but also for every pupil in the social by different way, different kind of message, different technology. For example, for the simple message, short message for every pupil by the message, by the phone, message in the phone, very simple and everywhere. Any pupil can receive and by the government indicate the telecom company to send that message to everywhere. The second thing that we have a special message for the pupil in the screen in every building, because in every building they have some like advertisement, so we have some message and have some instruction for the pupil, what the symptom, what is the who should be avoid, should be aware, and how can protect themselves. And when they have the fever or some symptom, where can they assess? That is every short message and very clear, and every pupil can see, and they can who are they in contact, who they in contact when they have symptoms, something like that, everywhere. I think that in Vietnam we apply a different way of the technology and very helpful. That is one of our success Yeah, that is support. I have some experience sharing from Vietnam.
I'm really struck how yet again you're bringing up the point of other sectors helping with the response to COVID, and including on health worker protection. You gave the example of the telecom, getting agreements with the telecoms companies to do mass messaging, for example, and also school education. And that brings me to a question around reducing risk and the whole business of education, which we will certainly cover in tomorrow's discussion, but it's so prominent. I mean, one of the features, at least of the European pandemic, has been that I think an awful lot of health workers never expected to get infected by a fatal disease in hospitals. I mean, not to the extent that this COVID response, and we weren't ready. And old-fashioned infection prevention and control measures have not been part of basic training. And I wonder whether those sort of issues, it'll come up tomorrow, perhaps we should park it, but thinking now about health workforce education changes that are needed, both on the topics and on the type of training, the way you train it. You brought up, Tuan, the issue of teams. Working in teams has been really important during the pandemic, and other speakers did too. I think looking at how you do basic training as well as on-the-spot training will be a real opportunity. The question is, can we seize it? We've had it before. Is this going to be enough? Are we alarmed enough now to really take the plunge and make some of these changes? Okay, let's move on. Another question that's come up a bit, which I think is important, but it hasn't had a lot of airtime in this particular webinar, is about working with the private sector. And a lot of countries in the three regions on this call have a very large private sector who've played quite a large role. Has there been anything special about how government tries to influence the behaviour of the private sector so their health workers are also protected? Who shall I ask to cover this? Shall I start with Jim and then see who else would like to come in? Jim, do you have any exposure to this at all?
I have some exposure, if that's the appropriate word.
Probably not.
Two or three angles to this. One is, and I did mention it before, but we have to recognize that in systems where there is a substantial private sector, there may often be dual practice where individual workers are working across the public-private boundary. So that raises issues around understanding where they are, how well they're protected, the risk that they can become a vector. So ensuring that it's clear who is responsible for ensuring that they're well protected. A second angle, which I'm aware of in a couple of countries, is that the private sector hospital system has been very much integrated into the overall response, but often to be the location either specifically of COVID patients or specifically non-COVID patients. So there's a distinction there. And I think that that's a sensible way of doing it in terms of demarcation, in terms of understanding where the focus should be in terms of high-level protection for health workers. And the third point, which I'll make, and it kind of picks back to your previous question around education, which will be dealt with tomorrow in detail, but I think there is a specific issue here related to the rapid redeployment of individual health workers, or in some cases teams, to be put to where they're most required. And anecdotal evidence I've heard there is that if there's inadequate training for those individuals who've had to move and are working in unfamiliar surroundings, that is a huge additional stressor. So there is a need to think through there the provision of effective training when people are moving across boundaries between different organizations, be they public or private, in order to be at the front line.
Thanks, Jim. That links very nicely with a comment Tuan also made about changing work environments, not just the environment you're in changing, but you may be being moved to work in a different place and in a different team, and how difficult that is. Okay, there's another really interesting question that's about stressors that's come up, which is, do the anxieties of health workers differ from other emergency community professions, for example, like the police? And I think that's quite interesting, because it then raises the question, have we got much to learn from how other professions cope with protecting their workers? Who would like to have a go at that, given that we're all health workers on this call? Has anyone got any thoughts? Or, Ellen, have you any thoughts on what you might, any exposure to how other professions that are front-facing with the community cope with, look after the anxieties of their workers? Over to you, Ellen.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's really interesting. And I think the anxiety level, both all the workers facing those the community will have anxiety. But I think for the healthcare professionals, I don't know how to say it. Is it more or less? Maybe it is interesting to explore more. But for the healthcare professionals, I think we have some background information, and they may help us, like to think of all the preventive measures when we are going out to meet with the communities, or we have protect everything. But for those people who are, those professionals who are not health background, they might not have a lot of information of how to protect themselves, and they will collect lots of message everywhere. Like an example in Hong Kong, because at that point of time, sometimes the policemen do need to go out to work with a group of people. So they may not have the full picture of how to do the prevention, but of course they have to do it. So in addition to these professionals themselves, the second cycle will be their families. And I think for the healthcare professional, they will think more about how to protect their families and what they can do. Sometimes for the nurses, they don't even go home. They look for hostels, look for hotels to stay in order to protect their families. But for other healthcare professionals, they may not think of this way of how to protect their families. And in up to here, I'm thinking maybe next time we learned when there are outbreaks, we might need a lot of public educations to share with other professionals, like hotel people as well. Like when people going from abroad and they come back and they have to go to a hotel for isolation, actually the policies in all the hotels are so different. And for some hotel, I can go into the room to visit the people who are being isolated. And some other places, we cannot even go into the lobby. So I think this also have an impact on the protection of the community. And share information and knowledge among different professions is important. It's not only within the healthcare professionals. That's what I'm thinking.
That's really interesting set of thoughts. Gulin, from your set of countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, have you got anything to add to what Ellen has said?
I think Ellen laid the question situation very well, but just I would like to emphasize one thing. I think it's a very interesting question, and I haven't read any comparison. I haven't come across, but I will look at it in more detail after this call. But at the same time, we have to accept that each profession has their own stress, and healthcare professions already face stress. I mean, it is not a stress-free profession, quite stressful professions, healthcare professionals. Just we are talking about a very rapidly increased stressors introduced to their work and private life, and how to cope with that. And I think this can happen in any profession in an extraordinary way, and we have to look at that. And in our region, we are, I mean, there are some studies which is coming up And we can see that quite significant number of proportion of health workers are expressing they are experiencing any kind of psychosocial stress, and also they need some support. But I think this is, and as the situation is prolonged, this stress level is increasing, I guess, and combined with fatigue.
Right. Yes, it's interesting. The stress level is acutely increased and in some cases sustained, although I suspect it fluctuates a little bit with workload. But it's interesting that also the normal coping mechanisms for a stressful job are being interrupted in COVID if you can't see your families as much. So you have to develop new ones. And I don't know if this is relevant. I heard quite an interesting news item last night on a local solution in Gloucester, which is very near where I live in the UK, had introduced what they called wobble rooms for staff. And what those were, that during their shifts, they could go to these quiet places and have a wobbly, where they were feeling stressed, and they could either have a coffee, have time out, phone their family, and generally take them away from the immediate stress. And when the chief executive asked staff what single intervention for coping with the stress they wanted to keep for the time being, at least in that particular hospital, apparently by a huge minority, the staff said keep that sort of timeout space, the wobble room they called it. So I think there are little local things one can introduce that are not necessarily costly, and we certainly can't forget it. Okay, so almost the last question I have is a hard one, which is, what evidence is there on what difference on the role of leadership and management in managing the protection of health workers, be it physical or social or mental? What are the role of different levels of leadership and management plays? Is there an evidence base beginning to accumulate? We've already said it's early days, but I'd be interested in thoughts on this from all of you've touched on it a little bit perhaps, but who shall I start with? Shall I start with Jim? What do you have to say on that question?
I think it's hugely significant question. I think it's in some senses too early to fully compare and contrast across systems to begin to identify what has made for good leadership in the circumstances. But I think I've got 2 or 3 comments here. The first is that, in a sense, a system with good leadership and good management is doing well in the circumstances. And it may be that, as often is the case, the leadership and management is largely invisible because things are going well, and it's doing its job properly. It isn't too prominent in terms of having to try and fight new fires every day. So I think that's the first point. The second is that I've been struck by the tone of the webinars and also this week, that there's a lot of emphasis on teams, on multidisciplinarity, on good communications, on rapid responsiveness, but all couched in a sense that people are working together to meet this huge challenge. And I think I can certainly think of some examples where there has become a very clear divide between senior leadership, particularly at a political level, and those who are having to deal with the pandemic on a daily basis in terms of being health workers or social care workers and so on. And that situation, I think, reflects an out-of-touch leadership, and one which probably is not well established to deal with the challenges that it's trying to meet. I'm going to give a specific example, which I found very impactful, and it's nicely a country that isn't in AAAH, so I can mention it, and that's Belgium. Belgium is one of the countries in Europe that has had the highest incidence of impact of COVID in terms of death rate. And there was a situation in the summer when, I can't remember if it was the Prime Minister or the President of Belgium, visited a hospital. And as she drove up in her motorcade, the nurses and other health workers of the hospital were lined up along the road. And as the motorcade went past, they all turned their back. And that was a silent protest, which reflected deep concern from the workforce that their concerns, repeated concerns, had not been, from their perspective anyway, properly taken on board or properly recognised. And I think whilst that's a very visible sign of disconnect between the workforce and the leadership, I think what we'll have to see is how that pans out as we move into the next stages of dealing with the pandemic and trying to get beyond it, and the extent to which leadership and senior management continues to be able to work with the workforce generally and work as one, or whether there are other countries where that disconnect, that dissonance creates further problems in terms of trying to move beyond COVID.
Thanks, Jim. Those are really interesting thoughts. I know we have Dr. Virot on the line. Virot, would you like to say anything on this particular question? Maybe not. Okay. Other panelists. Tuan, did you want to add anything to this point about
this question is very important because the role of leadership and management on the health workforce situations and response to COVID pandemic is very important. It's come from our country experience that we have because we can control the COVID. This one of the reason we can do a little bit good. Because in the country with very limited resources, not only the financing, but also for the human resources like Vietnam, we have to the role of leadership in the management of human resources to deal with the COVID very important. In order to do that in Vietnam, we the government, the Ministry of Health leader, they already have a direction for the different department to map out the expert from different expertise, and we also have some direction for the creating some like the team, the team that to support the other province, even support by the hospital within that province. That will have preparation. And in order to do that, we have to mapping and also have some need assessment for different area of the professional aspect. So that is our success. But the challenge here, that is the information, because the information to mapping the expert to know who are the have different capacity in different area is one important thing, and how can they share with each other. The second challenge is the financing to support the team to go to other place, not only by the normal day, the daily living, but also to support like the first question here. It is how to maintain the income of the health worker. They can support their family. That is very important because they go out of family and who are take care of them, and their income will be affected. So it's from Vietnam.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Now we're at time. I'd like to just give our third panelist, Ellen, a chance for one last comment she feels hasn't been made that she thinks is important. Do you have any last comment to make, Ellen? You have 1 minute.
Yeah, okay, 1 minute. Okay, thank you so much. And I think this is harmony the integration of individuals into a team. The reason why, because I believe that, and actually everybody do have a special leadership style. And the point at this point of crisis is not someone in high position, but is anyone work together, integrating the competences, the expertise, the work style, and be one, and then we serve the outcome. And that's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you very much. And I'm very conscious that we are at time. So with my task is to briefly summarize some, I wouldn't say the most important points, but what the points that have most struck me, because I have the privilege as moderator. So here's just a few reflections in summary for this really great debate. The first thing is that occupational risk protection of health workers involves three things: physical health, mental health, and social well-being. And there's a really strong convergence, I think, in the webinar today, that whilst addressing the physical issues like PPE and soon vaccines are incredibly important to protect the physical health, on their own, they're not enough to protect health workers to keep doing their jobs. We have to remember the enormous increase in mental issues and social difficulties that are faced. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing is we've learned an enormous amount in a very short space of time. And can our institutions, what can we do to make sure our institutions remember lessons for next time? We've touched on it a little bit. We've got some ideas, but it's critical. And that brings me to the fact that there are concrete things we can do ahead of time, during the pandemic, and immediately afterwards. And people gave very good examples. On the ahead of time, it was around the points that everybody brought up around organizational readiness, be that the big issues around education and training, having PPE stocks, getting IPC basics in place. And there are many retention policies. There are many others, but there's a whole question around what can we do better this time to be more ready for the future. It's always a challenge. During the pandemic, there's a broad set of issues around using data, getting good data and using it, the importance of communications, respite for workers, and being flexible and having helplines, all sorts of things, but really supporting them and their families. And then the question of compensation. I mean, crudely, there were many other issues, but that's one way of grouping them. And then again and again, the importance of working with other sectors to ensure protecting health workers. And last but not least, subject very close to my heart, health workers are not only hospital health workers, they're also community health workers, primary care workers on the front line, and we have to protect everybody. With that, I would like to thank everybody on this call. I'd like to thank Gulin, Jim, Ellen, Tuan, and the organizers of this webinar. And please make sure you log on same place, same time tomorrow for the third and last webinar, which is about education and training of health workers in the context of COVID. Please fill in the thing that's now on your screens, which is, did this session meet your expectations? Thank you so much to all participants, the most important people on this webinar, and thank you for the great questions. See you tomorrow. Goodbye for now. Good night, good afternoon, good morning for some.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.